In the winter of a year the court would later remember for its quiet cruelties, the marriage was announced with the ringing of bells and the clatter of carriages, as if sound alone might disguise its purpose. London glittered beneath frost and candlelight, yet behind drawn curtains and powdered smiles, the union was understood for what it was, a binding of estates, a sealing of loyalty, a concession extracted by the crown from a man too powerful to refuse. The Duke of Harrowfield had not sought a wife, nor had he pretended otherwise. He arrived at St. James's with the composure of one attending a treaty, his expression grave, his movements economical, his reputation already preceding him like a chill. He was 32, an age at which a man of his rank was expected to have softened, yet he remained unyielding, shaped by years of service, discipline, and loss. His dukedom was vast, his influence indispensable, and his silence famously absolute. Courtiers feared his notice more than his displeasure, for he wasted no words on those he did not respect. It was said he could end a career with a glance, and perhaps that was why the crown chose him, believing such a man could be trusted to obey when commanded, even if he resented the command. The bride stood beside him as the vows were spoken, her gloved hands folded with care, her posture flawless. Eleanor Whitcomb was 24, raised in a household where obedience was taught as a virtue and restraint as a form of survival. Her family had once been influential, though time and misfortune had thinned their fortunes, leaving behind a name of good breeding and little else. She had been chosen not for beauty alone, though she possessed it in a quiet, composed fashion, but for the absence of scandal in her past and the promise of compliance in her future. From the galleries, observers noted her calm, mistaking it for indifference. They did not see the effort behind her stillness, the discipline that kept her breath even as her life narrowed to a single path. She knew what the marriage meant, as everyone did. It was not whispered to her in secret, nor softened with false hope. She had been told plainly that this was her duty, and she had accepted it with the resolve expected of a woman who understood that refusal was a luxury she could not afford. The ceremony ended, the court applauded, and the Duchess of Harrowfield was created by proclamation and ink. Titles settled upon her like heavy garments, splendid and restrictive all at once. By nightfall, she found herself within the vast walls of her husband's London residence, its corridors echoing with footsteps that did not wait for her. Servants moved with trained efficiency, their deference precise, their curiosity carefully concealed. Every object seemed to belong to a history she had not lived and a future she had not chosen. It was there, in a chamber illuminated by the low glow of firelight, that the truth of her marriage was spoken aloud. The Duke did not raise his voice, nor did he cloak his meaning in cruelty. He addressed her as one might address a matter already decided, his tone formal, his words exact. He informed her that affection was neither expected nor offered, that their union fulfilled an obligation and would be conducted with propriety alone. She would be afforded respect, protection, and every material comfort appropriate to her rank. Beyond that, she was to hope for nothing. Eleanor received his declaration without protest. Years of instruction had taught her that dignity lay in restraint, and she would not surrender it on the first night of her marriage. She inclined her head, acknowledged his terms, and answered him with the same measured courtesy he had shown her. Yet when he departed, leaving the room quieter than before, the silence pressed upon her with a weight she had not anticipated. She stood for a long moment without moving, as though still awaiting instruction, before at last allowing herself to sit. The days that followed introduced her to the true theatre of the court. As the Duke's wife, she was displayed, assessed, and discussed with an intensity that bordered on fascination. Invitations arrived thick as snow, and she attended them all, learning quickly the unspoken hierarchies that governed every glance and gesture. Some greeted her with polite warmth, others with thinly veiled disdain, but few addressed her without calculation. She was a duchess by law, yet many regarded her as a temporary solution, a political instrument that had somehow learned to walk and speak. Whispers followed her through ballrooms and galleries, carried behind fans and lowered voices. They speculated about her origins, her suitability, her hold upon her husband, which was widely assumed to be non-existent. The Duke himself remained distant, appearing beside her when required and vanishing when ceremony permitted. He neither contradicted the rumors nor encouraged them, and his silence was interpreted as confirmation. Eleanor learned to endure the scrutiny with composure, though each slight accumulated like a small wound, invisible yet persistent. It was not cruelty alone that unsettled her, but uncertainty. She had entered the marriage prepared for indifference, yet she had not anticipated the loneliness of being so publicly bound and privately alone. Still, she held to her role, believing that constancy might yet earn her a measure of stability. What she could not know, standing beneath chandeliers that reflected her image back a dozen times over, was how swiftly observation would turn to accusation, and how soon the court would demand a spectacle greater than silence. The court, restless and unkind, had little patience for neutrality, and already its appetite sharpened. A single misstep, a careless glance, a voice raised too late or too softly, would be enough to invite judgment. Eleanor sensed it without understanding how, as though the air itself warned her that trial was approaching. And mercy was seldom granted. The season advanced with relentless ceremony, and Eleanor discovered that time at court did not soften judgment but sharpened it. Each appearance was weighed against invisible measures she had never been permitted to learn, and each success merely raised the standard by which she would be tested next. The Duke's presence beside her remained correct and distant, yet his absence was more remarked upon than his attendance. Society observed the space between them as avidly as it noted the jewels at her throat or the cut of her gown, drawing conclusions from what was not displayed. It was during a reception at Carlton House that the first deviation occurred, small enough to be dismissed by some, yet unmistakable to those who watched closely. As Eleanor prepared to enter the assembly, her escort delayed by courtly confusion, the Duke appeared at her side without announcement. He did not offer his arm with ceremony, nor did he address her aloud. He merely positioned himself so that she might take it, his gesture unadorned and unpublicized. The act lasted only a moment, yet it sent a subtle tremor through the room, for it suggested intention where none had been assumed. Eleanor felt the shift immediately. The warmth of his sleeve beneath her gloved hand was nothing remarkable in itself, yet the knowledge that he had chosen to stand with her altered her composure. She entered the room steadier than before, her gaze level, her movements unhurried. Observers noted the change, though they disagreed on its cause. Some claimed ambition had sharpened her confidence, others that the Duke had at last recognized the necessity of display. No one considered that loyalty might begin before affection, quiet and unannounced. The evening passed without incident, but its memory lingered. In the days that followed, the Duke made no further overtures, nor did he withdraw what he had granted. He continued to fulfill his duties with precision, yet Eleanor sensed a new attentiveness in him, restrained but unmistakable. Instructions were delivered with greater clarity, arrangements confirmed without delay. Once, when a court official addressed her with unnecessary condescension, the Duke's reply was swift and cool, correcting the man without raising his voice. The rebuke was slight, but it did not go unnoticed. Soon after, a gift arrived at Eleanor's apartments, delivered without ceremony and accompanied by no explanation. It was an antique brooch, finely wrought, bearing the crest of Harrowfield, its craftsmanship unmistakably old. Such an object carried meaning beyond ornament. It marked inclusion, continuity, and possession, and it had not been bestowed lightly. Eleanor understood at once the risk of wearing it, yet she also recognized the danger of refusing it. After a moment's hesitation, she fastened it at her collar and resolved to meet whatever consequence followed. The brooch accomplished precisely what caution predicted. Whispers multiplied, now edged with speculation rather than dismissal. Some saw the token as proof of reconciliation, others as a strategic display meant to quiet rumors. A few, less charitable, suggested manipulation, implying that Eleanor had somehow earned the emblem through arts unbecoming of her station. The court, which thrived upon ambiguity, encouraged all interpretations at once. Eleanor endured the attention with practiced calm, though the uncertainty unsettled her more than open disdain ever had. The Duke, for his part, offered no clarification. He neither reclaimed the brooch nor commented upon its appearance, allowing assumption to flourish unchecked. His restraint frustrated those who sought easy narrative, and in their impatience, they turned to invention. It was during a formal gathering, attended by members of the royal household and several foreign dignitaries, that invention hardened into accusation. The room glittered with rank and privilege, yet beneath its elegance ran a current of anticipation, sharpened by the knowledge that reputations were as fragile as glass. As Eleanor stood among the assembled guests, a remark was voiced with deliberate audibility, its phrasing polite enough to feign innocence while its implication struck cleanly. Her suitability as Duchess was questioned, her lineage hinted to be less secure than previously claimed, her rise implied to be the result of calculation rather than merit. The speaker did not name her directly, yet the turn of the room left no doubt as to the target. Silence followed, heavy and deliberate, inviting either confirmation or collapse. Eleanor felt the weight of that silence press upon her chest. She had been trained to endure insult, yet this was not mere unkindness. It threatened the legitimacy of her place and, by extension, the Duke's judgment. Custom dictated that she remain still, that she neither protest nor appeal. Such matters were not settled by the accused. She fixed her gaze ahead and prepared to absorb the blow, knowing that whatever followed would shape her future irrevocably. The Duke stood a short distance away, his expression unreadable. All eyes shifted toward him, waiting for the response tradition demanded. He was expected to do nothing, to allow the court's appetite to be satisfied by implication alone. His silence would preserve convention, protect ambition, and confirm the story already forming. For a breathless moment, he appeared inclined to grant them exactly that, his composure unbroken, his posture unchanged. Then, with deliberate calm, he moved. The sound of his step upon the polished floor cut through the murmurs like a blade, and in that instant, before a single word was spoken, the balance of the room altered. The Duke did not raise his voice when he spoke, yet the room bent toward him as though drawn by gravity. He addressed the assembly with the measured authority of a man accustomed to command, his words precise, his tone unassailable. He named lineage, corrected implication, and dismantled the accusation with a calm that permitted no interruption. Nothing in his defense appealed to sentiment. He spoke instead of records, of honor upheld through generations, of his own responsibility in choosing his Duchess, which he declared to be neither mistaken nor open to public conjecture. The silence that followed was not empty but stunned, thick with the sudden understanding that a line had been crossed and firmly redrawn. Eleanor remained motionless as the Duke concluded, aware that every gaze now flickered between them, measuring what had changed. She did not look at him immediately. To do so would have been an admission of reliance, and she had learned too well the dangers of appearing dependent upon another's will. Instead, she allowed the moment to pass as protocol demanded, her composure intact, her breathing controlled. Only when the murmur of conversation cautiously resumed did she incline her head in acknowledgement, a gesture small enough to be dismissed yet sincere enough to be felt. The gathering dispersed soon after, its brilliance dimmed by discomfort. Eleanor returned to the carriage with the Duke in silence, the space between them charged with words unspoken. The city passed beyond the windows in blurred impressions of lamplight and shadow, and she found herself acutely aware of his presence, not as an absence now, but as a steady fact. When they arrived at the residence, he offered her his arm once more, a formality repeated with intention. She accepted, her touch light, her expression composed, though her thoughts were far from still. Inside, the household seemed to hold its breath, servants retreating with practiced discretion. The Duke dismissed them with a glance and guided Eleanor toward a smaller sitting room, one seldom used for formal occasions. The fire burned low, casting softened light across the space, and the quiet there felt deliberate rather than imposed. He waited until the door closed behind them before speaking, his posture unchanged, yet something in his manner had shifted, as though a decision once made now demanded recognition. "I would have you understand," he said, his voice controlled, "that my intervention was neither impulse nor concession." He did not ask her to sit, nor did he approach her, maintaining the distance that had defined their marriage. "Your position was challenged." I answered, as was required. Eleanor met his gaze then, her expression steady. "I am grateful," she replied, choosing her words with care. Gratitude was safe. It acknowledged action without presuming motive. You spared me humiliation, I could not have answered myself. He inclined his head slightly, accepting the statement as accurate. For a moment, neither spoke. The fire cracked softly, and Eleanor felt the strain of restraint tighten between them. At last, she continued, compelled by a need she scarcely recognized. You were not obliged to do so, she added. Silence would have been understood. Yes, he said simply. It would have been. The acknowledgment settled heavily between them. Eleanor realized then that his choice had not been made lightly, nor without consequence. In defending her, he had drawn attention, invited scrutiny, and altered expectation. She saw, perhaps for the first time, the cost of his protection, and the awareness tempered her relief with something closer to responsibility. He turned slightly, as though considering the fire, though his attention remained upon her. I do not tolerate disorder, he said after a moment. Nor do I permit questions regarding what falls under my authority. The words were possessive in structure if not in tone, and Eleanor felt their weight. She could have retreated behind formality, allowed the conversation to conclude with safe ambiguity. Instead, she spoke with a quiet honesty that surprised them both. Then I regret that my presence has occasioned such disorder. His gaze returned to her sharply, and for the first time, emotion surfaced there, brief and restrained. You did not create it, he said. You endured it. The statement lingered, undeniable in its clarity. Eleanor felt a tightening in her chest, an unfamiliar stirring she refused to name. She lowered her eyes, gathering composure. I have been trained to do so, she replied. Endurance was expected of me. And yet, he said, it should not have been demanded to that extent. The admission was quiet, but it altered the air between them. Eleanor sensed the narrowing of a distance she had assumed immutable. She lifted her gaze again, studying him with new attention. He remained composed, yet the rigid certainty she had first encountered now bore the faintest fracture, a space through which understanding might pass. She reached, almost unconsciously, toward the brooch at her collar, her fingers brushing its edge. This, she said, has invited much interpretation. It was not intended for display, he replied. Nor was it meant to provoke inquiry. Nevertheless, it has done both. Yes, he agreed. So has everything since our marriage. The candor startled her. It suggested an awareness she had not credited him with, a recognition that silence had never truly protected either of them. She drew a breath, steadying herself. I do not seek favor, she said. Only clarity. He considered her for a long moment before answering. Then understand this, he said. I will not allow your name to be diminished, publicly or otherwise. Not while it is bound to mine. It was not a declaration of affection, nor even of intimacy, yet Eleanor felt its force settle within her, firm and irrevocable. She inclined her head, accepting what was offered without embellishment. The conversation could have ended there, and perhaps should have. Instead, as they stood in the quiet glow of the fire, both aware of the irrevocable shift that had occurred, Eleanor sensed that endurance alone would no longer suffice. Something had been set in motion, measured and restrained, yet undeniably alive. Morning arrived pale and deliberate, light creeping through tall windows as if uncertain it was welcome. Eleanor rose before the household stirred, seeking steadiness in routine, yet her thoughts returned to the previous night with persistent clarity. The Duke's words had been measured, but their effect lingered, altering her sense of place within the marriage. She dressed with care, fastening the brooch again, no longer as provocation, but as acknowledgement. When she entered the breakfast room, he was already there, reading correspondence, composed as ever, though the silence between them felt newly aware of shared consequence and unspoken intention forming. The day unfolded with obligations that demanded composure, yet every exchange carried subtle recalibration. At court, Eleanor noticed a shift in address, titles spoken with greater precision, bows fractionally deeper, curiosity restrained by caution. The Duke accompanied her more closely, not demonstratively, but with consistency that discouraged speculation. He spoke when required, listened when challenged, and allowed no slight to pass unanswered. In private moments between engagements, Eleanor observed his restraint as deliberate choice rather than indifference. She realized protection, once extended, reshaped expectation, binding them within shared scrutiny neither could now escape without retreat or illusion of safety remaining. Whispers did not vanish, but they altered in tone, cautious where once they had been bold. A second gathering tested this change, convened beneath glittering chandeliers and the attentive gaze of royal advisers. When Eleanor entered, conversation faltered briefly, then resumed with controlled civility. The Duke remained beside her throughout, his presence steady, his attention outwardly impartial. When another remark edged toward impropriety, he corrected it with courteous firmness, leaving no opening for rebuttal. Eleanor felt the room concede, not in warmth, but in reluctant acceptance, which proved more durable than open hostility or fleeting approval ever could promise long-term. That evening, as rain softened the city and reduced its clamor, Eleanor and the Duke returned home without escort or audience. In the carriage, he spoke first, remarking upon the day's proceedings with characteristic restraint, yet acknowledging their outcome. Eleanor responded with equal care, offering observation rather than emotion. Their conversation unfolded cautiously, revealing alignment rather than intimacy. She sensed respect growing where indifference once stood, and he seemed aware of her resolve in bearing consequence without complaint. When they arrived, he paused before parting, inclining his head with unmistakable regard, a gesture that unsettled her more than tenderness alone. Days passed, marked by quieter rituals and an easing of vigilance that surprised Eleanor with its comfort. The Duke no longer treated their arrangement as static obligation, but as a partnership requiring maintenance. He consulted her on matters small yet meaningful, acknowledging her judgment without flourish. She answered honestly, discovering confidence where caution had ruled. Their exchanges remained formal, but warmth surfaced in pauses, glances, and shared understanding. The household adjusted accordingly, servants responding to subtle shifts in authority and unity. Eleanor recognized that dignity, once defended publicly, required consistency privately, and she resolved to meet that standard fully together. Yet resolution demanded more than harmony, and Eleanor understood that acceptance could be revoked as swiftly as granted. She prepared herself for one final reckoning, aware that courts seldom forgave permanence. The Duke, too, appeared watchful, his composure tightened by anticipation rather than fear. When word arrived of a forthcoming assembly, charged with royal attention, neither spoke of it directly, though both recognized its significance. Eleanor spent the preceding night awake, reflecting upon how far endurance had carried her, and how close she now stood to claiming agency within constraint despite tradition, scrutiny, obligation, reputation, risk, sacrifice, uncertainty, duty, alone. The assembly arrived cloaked in ceremony, its grandeur sharpened by expectation. Eleanor entered with measured confidence, the brooch absent, her bearing sufficient declaration. The Duke stood beside her, his attention unwavering, his manner unmistakably aligned. Throughout the evening, challenges arose subtle and overt, yet each was met with unified response. He spoke when necessary, she when permitted, their coordination seamless. Observers sensed finality in this balance, recognizing that speculation no longer held purchase. Eleanor felt relief tempered by resolve, understanding that belonging carried responsibility equal to privilege, and that her choices would now echo beyond herself with lasting consequence ahead. Later, removed from spectacle, Eleanor and the Duke stood together in quiet reflection, neither compelled to speak. The distance between them had diminished, replaced by steadiness born of trial. He regarded her with recognition untainted by calculation, and she returned it without hesitation. No promises were exchanged, yet understanding settled, mutual and sufficient. They had crossed from obligation into alliance, shaped by defense rather than desire. Eleanor felt no illusion of ease, but she sensed permanence in his regard. As they parted for the night, certainty replaced fear, and silence felt earned rather than imposed upon them, finally, quietly, complete. With dawn approaching, Eleanor considered the path ahead with measured optimism, aware that love, if it came, would arrive cautiously. The Duke had not softened in temperament, nor had she abandoned reserve, Yet something fundamental had shifted. Respect had become habit, loyalty expectation. She understood now that her worth was no longer provisional, but affirmed through action. The marriage remained deliberate, its origins unchanged, yet its meaning had evolved. Eleanor resolved to inhabit her role fully, neither diminishing herself nor demanding more than was offered. In that resolve, she found contentment stronger than fantasy, and steadier than hope enduring quietly. The court would remember the season differently, recalling spectacle and alignment, unaware of the quieter victory achieved. Eleanor had entered marriage as instrument and endured scrutiny without promise of return. She emerged recognized, defended, and certain of her place. The Duke, once immovable, had chosen engagement over distance, authority tempered by responsibility. Together they stood within tradition without being consumed by it. Their story offered no grand confession, no theatrical surrender, yet it concluded with something rarer. In a world governed by restraint, they had forged trust, and within that bond, the possibility of love remained, patient and unafraid forever.